skip on standing up at front. I think you're going to have a hard time enough to figure out my accents. You don't have to figure out my hand gestures as well. I usually kick off with this tasting because I really focus very little on the wine and more focus on the theory of how we end up in what we're doing, specifically blends. The other reason is I'm the better part of the blends and they have a good part. So let's start off with that. Just to give you a bit of an overview, I think it's always interesting to put things in context. I assume there's quite a few people that's been to South Africa. If not, it's worth a trip to go to, or you've had varying degrees of information of the country. It's very easy to sum it up and exceptionally complicated to understand. The reality is this: 3% of the world's vineyards is located in or in South Africa. That's it. That's our sum total of contribution to wine in the world. So it's a very small proportion. The difference is this: if you take the French appellations, everything from Burgundy, Jura, Rhone, Valois, you go straight through to this Languedoc-Roussillon, and you take all of those areas and you combine them and compress them into a size, literally the size of Bordeaux, surface area-wise. That is South Africa. Bordeaux in its totality is the same size as all of South Africa's vineyards combined. The only difference is you've got all of those different appellations and systems compressed into that system. The reason for that is, I'm sure you've been alluded to in the previous 2 seminars, is mountains and soil, and then the ocean influence. There's mountains literally everywhere in the Western Cape. It crisscrosses the country straight through. It doesn't matter where you go, you have to cross mountains. And our soils are pretty much some of the oldest in the world, which also dictates the terms of what we're doing there. So that doesn't complicate, or that doesn't ease our job as marketing side or Warza side of marketing, or explaining to people what it is that we do in South Africa, because it's hellishly complicated, because everything is so fractured and small. The advantage of that system is, because it's so fractured and small, means we can be exceptionally nimble and find niche marketplaces for our wines to compete against other producers who's producing at much larger scales. So in South Africa, you'll find anything from a Loire-style Sauvignon Blanc through to something that's almost a carbon copy from New Zealand. That obviously doesn't make your life much easier understanding it, especially if you take the bottle off the shelf as to what to expect. So hopefully the seminars you've attended now is just going to shed a little bit of light in that entire process. Now the next question is, why blends and not single varietals? I think, again, if you look at the classic areas, you're looking at a time span of between 500 and 2,500 years of grape grain. And within that period, you remove and replant different varietals and experiment with different varietals until they've figured out what works. So obviously up in Burgundy, your Chardonnays and Pinot Noirs work, Loire, Chenin Blanc, Cabernet Franc. So by default, they've narrowed it down. The reality of modern world is that we don't have 2,000 years of keeping an accountant happy while we experiment. So we have to go full out and almost shoot very wide and see what works. And this is where blends gives us an amazing opportunity. Now, the first seminar this morning with the icon wines, all of them except for 2 wines from Boer were all blends. And that's already a stepping stone and an indication as to what blends can do within the country. It affords you 2 things. Firstly, you can create a wine that can't be compared to other wines within the world, which is crucial, because if you start imitating other wines, you're always going to be second. And I'm not interested in being second somewhere along my line. I've got 40 odd vintages to do my work within my lifetime. So why aim my entire life to try to imitate something that somebody else has been doing for 500 years? Makes no sense. So it gives you a blanket of actually creating new, unique wines that has got a footprint as to where it comes from, but gives you the versatility of doing something completely different. The second advantage of working with blends is, by default, you still have to make straight varietal wines before you can make the blends. And that time span gives you the time to actually figure out each individual block. In my case, it's about 65 different batches spread over 15 different varietals coming into my property, where you work with those varietals like it's a single varietal, and year after year you figure it out, and then you can narrow it down. And that's where I think the difference becomes where's the future? I don't think there's an advocacy from our group of saying blends are better inherently than single varietals. Single varietals need a lot of time to figure out in a vineyard-specific sites and fine-tuning the process. And the reality is, majority of our vineyards, except for the Shin and Blancs you tasted next door, all come from vineyards ranging from anywhere between 8 and 25 years old, which in terms of vineyard is not very old. And then also you don't have 50 years of experience working with those vines. So blends are almost for us a utopia. It gives us a clean palette of creating any wine we want to, and at the same time gives us time and opportunity to figure out those each individual blending components and then make single varietals, as we all do within our respective portfolios of wines. So for wines we're tasting today, we're going to skip straight to the end. My two wines are number 6 and 7. And I'm going to very briefly touch on the mentality of these two wines and how they were made. I'm not going to do all of the technicalities. Technicalities I'm going to leave up to you guys. We can literally ball the socks off you when we start going on to winemaking terms. I'd rather have a Q&A of getting questions and answering relevant questions rather than giving you a marketing spiel of a wine. But there's a very specific reason why I chose these two wines out of my entire portfolio. For Waterford Gem 2007 with glass number 6, this is our, let's call it flagship wine of the property. It's a 7 varietal blend. The base of a wine is formed by Cabernet Sauvignon, then Syrah, Mourvedre, Cabernet Franc, Merlot, and then Sangiovese and Barbera. The next one number 7, I'm going to explain the thinking behind it. It sounds like a fruit salad. The next wine is Syrah Mourvedre, Sangiovese Barbera. Both of these wines come from the same property. Our property is located in Stellenbosch, up against the Helderberg Mountain, literally up against the mountain slopes. And all the vineyards range between 8 and 14 years old, so they're quite young still. And the reason for these two wines being here, the vineyard practices are identical within the blocks of what we've got on the property. We don't manage anything differently. I'm saying we've got a premium block or a lesser block. Everything's trying to manage an ultra premium level. Hand harvested, the mentality in the cellar is exactly the same. Obviously, winemaking practices from one vertical varietal to the next does differ. But although coming from the same site and one vintage difference, there's a quantum difference between these two wines, and it's purely because of blending and aging. And that's the difference. You would be hard pressed to actually think that these two wines come off the same property in the same country. And that's the influence that we can have on the process, in the blending process and the aging process. I blend very early on, literally when I get back home next week somewhere, I think. I'm going to start the blending process for the 2011s. So my blends are made within 5 to 6 months off vintage, and then the blends age together, depending on the blend, anywhere between 14 and 20 months. So the Gem 2007 as a blend aged 22 months in 2 to 5 litre French barriques, ultra tight grain, and only medium toast. So although it's almost 2 years in barrel, the wood doesn't dominate the wine, which I find almost offensive in wines. So when wood completely dominates the wine, it has to play a supporting role rather than a dominating role. Because otherwise, if you're trying to hide poor quality fruit or something, or just sloppy winemaking, one of the two. The Pebble Hills, or the Beacon Stream on the right-hand side, inherently because of where the grapes come from, off the property and the production method, that wine sees absolutely no oak whatsoever. It's stainless steel and left purely for about 14 months to polymerize and settle. It's got quite a wild cherry character, especially like almost 30% Mourvedre. If you're familiar with Gigondas wines, it's a very wild spice character. And then the two components which is most important, and I think Helen will touch on it as well with one of these blends, is the use of Sangiovese and Barbera. Now the question I heard in the previous session before the previous one, why the Italian influence or lack of Italian influence, whatever the case may be. We've got an open policy as to what we can plant and what we can do. The reality is, technically we've been making wine for 350 years. The reality is we've only been making focused, experimental, high-end quality wines for the past 35, 40 odd years. That's as simple as that. Regardless if your farm was founded in 1690. It's the last 20 years that really count because of better plant material, technology, cellar technology, all of those things go on. Now, the use of Southern Rhone, Spanish, and Italian varietals makes complete sense to us because of our environment. It's a warm environment with low amounts of water in the majority of places. And the great thing about specifically Italian varietals, it adds a lot of acidity to wine. There's a zing of freshness to all Italian wines. And that's why Italian wines are designed for food consumption, because of that freshness of wine. So the only reason why I use Sangiovese and Barbera in these two wines, I find it brings down the dry tannin level slightly, and it picks up the natural acidity. And the reason why I need to pick up the natural acidity with those two is because we've stopped acidification of our property in 2004 out of principle. So I find this is a natural alternative to acidify the wines and getting a freshness and a savouriness to the wine, which otherwise you'll have to basically chemically adjust, which in my point of view is those wines just don't age properly after 10, 15 years. The acid stays pronounced and tart as it is, but the fruit develops into a secondary and tertiary lighter characters. You get a disconnect between the two wines. Over to you guys. Any questions?
I just need you to slowly go back over the blend.
Sure. It doesn't really matter how slow I do it, you're still going to get confused, but let's go for it. The Beacon Stream is based on Syrah, Mourvedre, and then Sangiovese Barbera. And the Syrah Mourvedre component basically makes up 70% of wine.
Okay.
Right? On the gem, Cabernet forms the base, 40%. Then you've got about 20% Syrah, 15% Mourvedre, and then the remaining 25% made up of almost equal amounts of Cabernet Franc, Merlot, and then a very small amount of Sangiovese and Barbera. Talking about 2% of each of the last two. And it's purely for acidification. Very similar to using Petit Verdot in a Bordeaux blend. Anything above 4 to 5% addition of Petit Verdot in a Bordeaux blend, you pick it up straight away. And that's why that wild cherry character in the pebble of Beacon Stream is so pronounced. With me, you're looking at about 30-odd% in the two Italian varieties.
How long are you macerating the skins on?
Maceration for me is very quick. Even something like Cabernet, maximum about 15 days from harvest to pressing. The question does come from the Bordelaise guys, and we get a lot of them coming through the properties, saying, how long do you macerate pre-fermentation, post-fermentation? We don't, well in our case, we don't macerate. We run until the wine is dry, and then we press. We've got a supercharged amount of tannin and colour in our wine as it is. The other thing which you can probably consider within terms of Bordeaux versus South Africa is the amount of hang time. But Bordeaux, probably not the last 5 years because of the heat issues they've been having. But hang time pretty much from flowering to picking in Bordeaux traditionally was up to about 110, 115 days. So you get a very ripe pit and stem combination. So you've got very little green tannin. Obviously, we've lost since 2003 where the heat waves continuously striking through. You actually start getting issues in Bordeaux where alcohol and greenness is an issue because they have to deal with things that we've been dealing with for the past 80 years. But with a maceration point of view, our hang times very rarely exceed 85 to 95 days because of the environment we are in. Our summers are hot, our winters are quite dry. So you find that sugars get elevated way above where it should be. And our sun intensity, just purely the UV intensity of what we deal with in the southern hemisphere, is absolutely no comparison to what they deal with in the northern hemisphere. So those things are things we need to consider. So if you pick grapes that's had hang time for 90 or 95 days, there might still be a very slight greenness in the pits. If you find with extended maceration within a 14% alcohol environment, that alcohol goes and dissolves all those tannins. And it's not the type of tannins we're after because there's a green astringency to that tannin and not a dry tightness. It's purely we just don't need more colour and tannin. It's as simple as that. Anything else? that simple.
Well, I'm going to take over.
Obviously, we're going to work through it so you guys can interact and then we'll tag on each other. I think it should answer the question. Thank you.
Good.